Hello and welcome back to Friends of Europe's Frankly Speaking podcast. Today I'm going to take you under the oceans and see what's happening in the murky waters beneath. Joining us as a special guest today is Jukka Savolainen, who is Director for Vulnerabilities and Resilience at the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki. That's an organization jointly supported by NATO and the EU to build capabilities to counter hybrid warfare. Jukka is also a senior officer of the Finnish Coast Guard and served on the EU police mission in Afghanistan and is an expert on border security at the European Union in Brussels. Good morning to you. And also with us is Chris Kremidas-Courtney, my senior fellow here at Friends of Europe in the Peace, Security and Defense program, and an expert on hybrid warfare and our digital future. Well, Jukka, let me start with you. We're going to look beneath the oceans at some of the security challenges that have been highlighted since the start of the war in Ukraine. The underwater explosions that wrecked the Nord Stream gas pipelines from Russia to Germany in September of 2022 suddenly propelled seabed security into the headlines. Why is this such an issue now, and what's going on down there?
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for this question, which is very timely. I think the potential of the Nord Stream pipeline explosions has not even been explored in its entirety, because what we know is certainly there was an explosion, and this happened already more than half a year ago, and we still have no credible attribution. So we don't have nobody is saying for sure with evidence who did it and for what reason. And now if we look at the potential of this event, there is a possibility to sabotage the relations between Ukraine, Germany, and United States in the war of Ukraine. And of course, it has a huge impact in the popular mindset in Russia itself. So somebody's playing with very big cards here. Also, we survived this winter without a significant energy crisis, but this was also a significant threat. Had we had much colder, and had we had more detonations in the other gas pipelines in the North Sea area, we could really have had a serious shortage of energy in Europe. So I think this altogether shows how important this underwater infrastructure can be, and in the future crises, it will be exploited one day to create a really big societal crisis in some of our countries.
Well, that's fairly scary. And of course, underwater, we don't just have gas pipelines, we also have cables that carry all of our communications, our internet traffic, our banking system is dependent on underwater cables as well as space. So, Chris, what's Europe doing about seabed security? What's NATO doing, and what needs to be done?
Well, thank you, Paul, and good morning, Jukka. I think the first thing is to look at is, the entire idea of undersea critical infrastructure began in Europe in 1850 with the first cable between France and Great Britain. And about 7-8 years later, you had the first transatlantic cable, the telegraphic cable laid between the two continents. So I think it's, this is sort of the home of this issue where it all started. And as you recall, Paul, back in 2019, Friends of Europe, we had an undersea cable incident in our tabletop exercise for the EU, NATO, and the private sector to see how they would deal with it, to really put the issue in front of them. And, we've been trying to sort of raise this awareness, but it really took the incident that Jukka just so well described in September of last year to really bring it to the fore. And so I think there's a few things happening. The first is on the NATO side, they have, NATO for years has had underwater research, at the center down in La Spezia in Italy. They've always had consortia doing all kinds of research on underwater surveillance, on underwater vehicles and whatnot. That's ongoing. There's a new NATO cell that was stood up in February in the NATO SecGen's office, supposedly to coordinate undersea infrastructure. I'm not sure how. I think it's useful for sharing information and whatnot, but the real public-private connection and role there is between the state and the private companies. And I think NATO can sort of share information and whatnot, but I'm not sure how much we should expect that cell to be able to do. On the EU side, you're seeing a lot more new activity from the European Defense Agency. They have an ongoing program that could become a PESCO program. They're doing a study on capability gaps and tech solutions to underwater surveillance and intervention. And then you look at the individual national programs. The French have 2022 have a seabed warfare strategy. So it's a very military. You would think the French have a very military approach because they're spending a lot on developing undersea drones and anti-mine robots. They're looking at being able to go down to depths of 6,000 meters, which is kind of a standard for if you want to surveil and intervene on these types of things. But more importantly, I think if you look in France and Italy and others on the private sector side, this is where you really have companies like Orange Marine, a large French company, that if you're laying cable or fixing an undersea cable anywhere in the Atlantic and a lot of the Indian Ocean, it's probably a French company doing it. And it's probably a French company or a British company or someone else, but Orange Marine is a big player in this arena. So, in France, they've already had a very well-developed commercial side. I think the military's catching up. For the Italians, it's very similar. There's a large company there, Sparkle, from the TIM group, that has signed a deal with the Italian Navy to provide surveillance assistance, to share undersea maps and whatnot, and that's been ongoing. But what's really interesting what the Italians are trying to do is they've taken a study from the UK National Physics Lab. So the UK National Physics Lab did a test to see, can you take the existing cable, fiber optic cables can detect things based on the water pressure of things moving by or earthquakes or whatnot. And they found a way to turn underwater cable infrastructure into a global sensor system. Now, how sensitive it is, we don't know yet, but the Italians are trying to leverage that, saying, hey, we have these existing cables. Can we use them already as a surveillance system? And of course, detecting an earthquake and detecting a submarine are two very different things. But the Italian approach is very much in the surveillance arena. The UK is also continuing with testing undersea drones. Germany is looking more to optimize existing data and infrastructure rather than building anything new. There's a cooperative activity with Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden on surveillance in the region. So there's a lot of activity that from this awakening from September. And we could talk a little later about sort of some of the challenges and the costs and some of the other challenges to overcome. But I think Europe has awakened. There's a lot of activity going on, but it's sort of, what that will mean in real terms remains to be seen in the future.
Yeah, and I know that, I was talking to somebody who in the European Commission who's been looking into this stuff and working on it, and even getting European member states to share the information with each other about where their underwater infrastructure is quite a challenge. It didn't come naturally, let's say. And then the question of whether this should be done by the EU or whether it should be done in NATO is also a bit of a challenge from what I hear. Jukka, what new developments are there sort of looking at, the hostile forces or potential adversaries? What new developments are there that we should be concerned about that are making this more of a challenge?
Well, what we know is that Russians have had long-lasting programs in deep sea operations, and they seem to have specifically built submarines who can go there and pick a cable from 3 kilometers. And of course, if you do this kind of sabotage now in a very deep sea, the reparation will simply take a hell of a lot of time. And they have actually given a demonstration 1 or 2 years ago. They a couple of cables in North Norway were cut and even dragged a big some kilometers away from its site, just to showcase that this is what we can do. And so if we have a military capacity and an idea that has been tested, then we should put it in on the list of our existential threats, and certainly at the right moment, some cuts of cables over the Atlantic would damage very much the economy and political life in the transatlantic community. Would be very dangerous. So I think this needs to be taken seriously, and this must be seen as a naval operational requirement and strategic requirement in longer run, because right, as Chris rightly said, it will be this is all private business, and which means that finally the consumer will pay. But and the states will never have and the navies will not have the capacity to repair this kind of cable cuts. So it will be a private business. But what the states can do, I come back to where I started from, the attribution. So the risk of this kind of sabotage is very high if the adversary knows that they can come out of it and they will not be caught red-handed. And on the contrary, if they think they will most likely be based on evidence, they will be shown to be the guilty one. It turns the whole political impact that they are looking for, it turns it upside down. Because should it be that we don't have electricity or banks or something in Europe or United States, and if we immediately show that, okay, thank you Russians, you did it, here's the evidence, our population will be furious against them. If we cannot show who did it, and they will of course have a very good imagination in delivering nice stories, that would mean that our population is angry at our governments. So here again, the attribution needs to be taken seriously, which means that we need to have a capacity to detect what is going on. To some extent, we cannot prevent this kind of operations. You simply can sabotage and detonate or cut cables. This cannot be prevented in advance. But we should be able to show this happened and identify somebody who is moving in the area. And then we come to the question of sharing information. And it's national, it's classified. Of course, it's very classified. Where are our hydroacoustic sensors? You just simply cannot give this information away very easily. So in this case, also in case of Nord Stream, I think it is very possible that some Western services know exactly who did it, but they just cannot say it because it's classified. The sensors are classified. Even that's classified if they don't know. It has to be classified too, because that's what happens always with the Intel community guys. They just hate the idea that their capacity would be revealed, be it good or bad. And I think we are stuck with this problem, but I would still put this on a list of naval forces planners to-do list.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, because obviously one of the ways in which the United States, in particular the UK, got ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was by declassifying a lot of information which would normally be very, very secret and very closely held, in order to denounce in advance what the Russians were up to. So maybe people will come to see that's valuable also in the undersea cables, as you described. So then, if we can't prevent it, what do we do about it other than naming and shaming? Is the cutting of undersea, transatlantic, or cable an act of war that will lead to invoking Article 5? It's not quite mentioned in the same way in the NATO strategic documents as, say, a cyber attack or an attack in space, an attack on critical infrastructure in international waters. What do you think, Chris? What needs to be done about it?
Well, I think just to touch quickly on what Jukka had mentioned, and this gets back to some of the challenges back when Jukka and I were working together in Helsinki at the Hybrid COE some years ago, the challenge of attribution and crisis decision making, because when it comes to hybrid threats against undersea infrastructure like this, you think about the kinds of things that can knock out cables and pipelines, and you're talking things like fishing nets, anchor strikes, earthquakes, underwater landslides. There are a lot of. I mean, there are 2 cable outages globally every week, according to the industry. I mean, things are happening globally, right? And this is partly why the attribution is such a challenge. Like, let's take the example in 2021. The cable between Norway and its Svalbard island, that a Russian trawler just sort of ran over with his fishing nets and dragged the cable away. It was a marine research cable, experiment and whatnot. But they had deniability. Oops, so sorry, it was an accident. I'm so sorry, right? And so this is partly what makes it so difficult, is that a lot of the potential causes are sort of oops accidents, right, that happen globally. If there's anchor strikes on cables all the time. And so even though these things are mapped, oh, I'm so sorry. So I think that's one thing we have that makes it such a challenge. It's the same kind of challenge we have on land. And that is, how do you prove it was an accident? It wasn't operator error. It wasn't broken equipment. It wasn't poor maps or whatnot. And so that's what makes it so difficult. How do you take that kind of evidence to a multilateral body like NATO and say, we think we should declare Article 5 on this? I can tell you from having run a few exercises like that for bodies like that you're not going to get a consensus. Neither at the EU nor at NATO, because there are a lot of nations that say, I need a lot more evidence. I need a lot more certainty to take this back to my capital and say this is what we should, a view we should support. And I think but that gets to the heart of hybrid threats, that they're so when they're so difficult to attribute, it makes crisis decision making that much more difficult. So I think that's one thing here, is that if we just think about what is normal in the undersea environment, cables are one thing. Pipelines are a little different because they sit in shallower waters, but they're also a little sturdier in some ways. So I think that, cables, there are outages twice a week somewhere in the world. There are ships from every continent, companies that go and fix them. They drag them up to the surface and splice them together and drop them back in the water. Undersea energy infrastructure is a different story. It's a lot more complicated. The engineering, the cost, the time to fix is, it's not even on the same scale as fixing undersea cables. So I think, it gets us back to the attribution and crisis decision-making challenges that we need to overcome. And this is, if this was easy, we would have done it by now.
So is this an asymmetrical vulnerability? Because we in the West use a lot of, all our systems run on these cables and on these underwater pipelines and so on. We're very dependent on them. Russia, I assume, is much less dependent on undersea infrastructure. What about China? How dependent is China or not on undersea infrastructure? And is there some kind of undersea balance of terror that we can create that will somehow keep our systems safe by putting the other side's systems at risk? Or is that not possible because of the asymmetry? Jukka?
Important and timely questions. First of all, from the technical viewpoint, I think, yes, West is more dependent on these systems, because it's the adversary here actually is now mainly the huge geopolitical and geoeconomic entity that contains the Eurasian continent, main parts, the eastern parts. China with its huge economic potential and population, Russia with its huge natural resources, and then the other territories around that where the competition is just about to start. So it's a continental issue. There is nowhere such amount of cables, etc., as we have in the Atlantic between North America and Europe. So in comparison, we are more vulnerable. And then can we have a deterrence? And I think this is really an asymmetric issue, because nobody thinks of this, but you don't find a commander in a Western democratic society whose actions are based on rule of law. You don't find the general or admiral who signs an order to go and cut these and these and these commercial cables, because this will be kept secret for a while, but at some point there is quite a big risk that the issue will be taken into a court, where this person personally is asked to repay the damages to the company who is owning these cables. So here we have another issue which shows an asymmetric conflict between us and authoritarian regimes who wouldn't think of this kind of problems. So I think we cannot deter by saying that if we don't like you, we will cut your undersea cables. To the problem still to the volume, we can have accidents which have a local impact. But in the case of war, if we have almost all of the Atlantic cables cut, then we know somebody's doing this on purpose. And it is very clearly, of course, very close to an act of war, or it should be regarded as an act of war, depending again on how can we show that credibly enough to our political decision makers and citizens that these guys did it. After all, well, NATO was never tested in terms of declaring wars, but it's always, of course, no matter what the strategic or operational planners write in their papers, matters of peace and war are always political decisions, so they will be taken in the situation based on the evidence that there is at hand and the political leeway for maneuvering. So I wouldn't be so worried about that. But I come again, as you see, to the point that we should be able to show who did what. And as you, Paul, rightly said, Americans used this very effectively in the start phase of the Ukrainian war. And I think it's an important example. Somebody must have given political guidance, or at least collected political approval in the intelligence community to get prepared to release this kind of information. And I think this can, well, what happens by nature, all authorities, the officials, I mean, who are dealing with the issue, they are keeping all the secret issues secretive, and they continue. They would not reveal anything, and they don't propose revealing anything. So by exercising in advance these kind of patterns, I think this could be possibly very useful, and it can make the release of information months or years faster if it has been exercised in advance. So I think we could study more what the Americans did in Ukraine with relation to potential damages to our undersea infrastructure. It's a good idea.
Great. Chris, your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think it is historically the cable links in the Atlantic between North America and Europe have always been sort of the thickest lines in the map. But if you look in the Pacific and look at Southeast Asia, that is where a lot of the growth is. And in particular, right now, what we're seeing is a lot of growth in cable connections between Asia and Europe. The TIM Group in Italy is building one now, connecting Genoa all the way to India and everywhere in between. So like a great new, a very fast trunk road. You have Greece and Egypt building an energy cable to take wind and solar power from Egypt and cable it up to Athens to supply, to power homes in Athens. So you have a lot of growth across the board. But I think if you look at Southeast Asia, that's where the great U.S.-China competition is happening. You have Chinese and American companies competing for the contracts to build the cables across the board, connecting parts of Asia together. And there are, given the terrain on land and given some of the politics on land, it's actually, in a lot of cases, cheaper and easier just to drop a submarine cable in Southeast Asia to connect different countries, right? And so I think that is where the growth is, and that's where I think we're going to see a lot of the competition. Speaking of Asia, and since Taiwan is always in the news, the last year or two, we keep seeing the cable between, Taiwan's Matsu Islands, which are between mainland China and, between China and Taiwan. The cables keep being cut for different, by fishing vessels or other Chinese vessels coming out and cutting them. And I mean, that's a real indicator, because I think if there's ever, I'm not saying that'll happen, but if there was ever any kind of aggression, kinetic aggression against Taiwan by China, the first step would be against the Matsu Islands to knock out radar sites, possibly even to seize terrain to launch from. And so I think that's one space to watch, as we're seeing that playing out there in that region. I think it's always watching the cable connection between the Matsu Islands and Taiwan is always one to watch. But I think this is also, we're seeing this as part of the larger global competition, because it's not just, can you cut someone's communications, can you monitor them? I mean, these cables are a gold mine for, secret intelligence agencies who want to clamp on and gather the data and sort of figure out what's being said. So I think, that's why the surveillance of these systems, the protection of these systems is so important. And I think the thing that we have to remember is it's a lot easier to surveil these systems than it is to intervene. So in many ways, it's like having one police car for the entire highway system of Italy for intervention. You can see everything that's happening, but you've got this one car, because having any kind of intervention capacity at scale is entirely too expensive. No nation can afford to sort of intervene and be ready everywhere. And Jukka's so right. We can't do much to prevent it. So it's, build as much hardness into these systems as we can, have the ability to surveil them, have the ability to attribute if there's a bad actor that's done something, and then we can, then we have our whole menu of political and other options.
And I guess finally, the other factor, Jukka, is that we need greater resilience. That means probably we need more redundancy, the ability to switch over to other cables quickly if a cable is taken out, and so on. How are we doing on that area?
Yes, I think business is taking care of it right now. That's how the internet would work. It's the more we have cables everywhere, the messages would be relayed through a new route. Nobody knows where it's going. It simply goes around the globe. And there would be, of course, then jams, and then messages would be categorized based on price, etc. But nobody will be able to switch off the entire global communications yet. But temporarily, still we are in a situation where aerial damage can be big by hitting these communication cables, because so far you don't have any relevant amount of capacity transferable to the satellite systems. But even that will be seen in future when those who have bought and opted in would be shifting their services, the most important part, to satellite comms, and they would be more resilient. I think this is one of these things where the technology is helping us quite soon. I'd like to mention, going back a little bit, but we must pay attention to the fact that BRICS, BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they have a sea cable connecting these countries which could indicate an idea, of course, an earlier idea of maintaining some sort of communication. And in case there will be disturbances on the other side. And also we need to bear in mind that the Russian government has explained, it was 5 years ago already, that they have created a system where they will, in case of need, they will cut entirely the Russian internet. The Russian internet, they will cut it off from the international internet, and it keeps working, both the military and civilian version. And they said they tested it. So, and I think it's quite credible, because after all, it comes to a country like Russia. It only comes from the internet arrives along some cables, and the points are not endlessly numbered. It's just a few points. If you choke them off, then you have a separated internet. So they have I think there are possibilities to in a context of something else always going on, widening a military conflict or having a new stage. It's possible that they are preparing to damage us in unforeseen ways.
Well, thank you very much, Jukka Savolainen. Thanks, Chris Kremidas-Courtney. We have to end it there for this week. Plenty of food for thought about some of the things that are awaiting us beneath the seas. I'll end it there, and the next edition of the Friends of Europe Frankly Speaking podcast will be with you soon. But for today, goodbye.
We'll leave it there for today. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the Frankly Speaking podcast newsletter, or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And if you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or a rating, as it truly helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And don't forget to tune in again, this time next week.